Hi, my name is Lenneér and I'm the live action director, part writer and part editor of this new film, The Shadow Out of Time. I'm also the one, since 10 years now, responsible for Millroad film. I'm here now to lead you through this behind the scenes feature called Chasing Shadows. I was dragged into the world of Lovecraft when I was a teenager and read the novels and came across the role-playing game Call of Cthulhu. I also find the huge fan base centered around Lovecraft at that time. Rickard made a Lovecraft film in '99 called The Evil Eye, or Ondskans öga in Swedish. I did my first Lovecraft movie in 2008 when I was a teacher in Karlshamn. It was called Jordgömda or Earthbound in English, and it was kind of a parody of a Lovecraft story. It was in very many ways an experiment, and it was a true one-man show because I was both behind the camera and in front of it. I did all the work. I simply tried what I could do with the limitations I had. In 2009 I did my second Lovecraft movie. It was a version of At the Mountain of Madness, a longer novel by Lovecraft. But our version was more like a parody or a spoof of the original, and it was called Terror from the Abyss. Because we both were fans of Lovecraft and amateur filmmakers, I and Rickard decided to do a movie together. And the story, The Shadow Out of Time, was among our favorites, so it was an obvious choice. So early in the process we decided that Rickard will do the animated dream sequences and I myself will do the live action acting parts. So that was the way we did it.
I'm Richard Svensson and I'm responsible for the historic and prehistoric sequences in The Shadow Out of Time. And these scenes were accomplished using a mix of Photoshop backgrounds and stop-motion animation. And you can see some of the puppets used in these animations behind me here. I wanted to make my own version of The Shadow Out of Time using only stop-motion animation and dealing only with the parts of the story talking about how the Yith came to Earth, how they established themselves, and what eventually happened to them. And I told Daniel about this and he said, well, I want to make my own version too. So why don't we combine our two versions? And that's exactly what we did.
We recorded the film in one day in my childhood village called Lenneér. It's a very small village on the countryside. It has about 700 inhabitants or something, and I like to in some way keep my shootings there. in every film or project I try to have at least one scene there on location. So I think it's kind of my way to show gratitude to where I came from.
Då är vi i Klockargården. Det är den 1 juli 2011 och vi ska påbörja inspelningen av Skuggan ur tiden idag. Är tanken här. Jag är lite orolig för hur det ska gå och hur allt ska falla på plats. Jag gör förberedelser nu typ 45 minuter innan vi ska börja. Så det är mycket nu. Här har vi storyboarden uppsatt då. Inte provisoriskt. Tanken är att jag ska filma och bocka av här varefter vi tar bilder då.
Åke Rosén, the actor we used in the role as Mr. Nathaniel Peasley in the film, was a real catch. He added things to the character along the line and along the process. One funny thing there is I used to when I was a child, Åke was a teacher to me in secondary school. So he was teaching me biology back then. But then when we went older and I was in the university, Åke showed up there and we were having the same course together, and it was a course in digital filmmaking. So that was when our lines crossed again, and we began to use Åke as an actor and a narrator. My final project at the university was an animated film. And Åke was in it as the voice of the movie, the narrator. So that was the beginning of our partnership.
Så, då har vi scen 1, take 1. Varsågod, föreläs.
Ja, för att jag hamnar ju ifrån.
Ja. Mm.
Just det.
Ska vi prova? Säger jag varsågod. Ställer ner och det blir som en reaktion så här, när du ser golvet så.
Ja, ja.
Och då står du så här och tittar.
Och bara trampa på.
Och ja, precis som du gjorde där.
Jaha.
För det är samma bild då.
Ja, just det.
Jag är så chockad, jag är bara nyfiken och lite så.
Ja, och nyfiket skräckslagen skulle jag säga.
Jaha, okej.
Ja, allting är intressant men samtidigt väldigt obehagligt.
Ja, just det. Ja. Är det igenkänningens glädje eller är det bara är det förvåning eller skräck?
Igenkänningens fasa.
Jaha.
Det är alltid Lovecraft.
Ja, ja.
Det är alltid fasa.
Ja.
Allting är ohyggligt.
Usch. Ja.
Ja, vi är redo. Backa lite.
Men vet du hur 54 ser ut?
Nej.
Nej.
Men är det inte den han springer nu?
Nej.
Nej. Varsågod.
Åke took the project to a new level, I think, because it was important for the story to have an actor in the right age as the character in the novel, and he was very good, I think. we told him to act out very, very loud and expressive, like this, a little overacting, because we like it that way. I think Åke did a very good job, because the story is very, very complex, and we didn't shoot it straightforward. We shoot it mixed around, and it was all a green screen and different clothes on Åke, and we was like, now you're in the polar extreme, and it's cold and it's snowing and it's winter, and then 10 minutes later it was like, now you're in the jungle, or in the desert or something. And Åke was, okay, well, yes, what should I do?
Varsågod Åke. Titta mot templet där.
Det är här.
Jaha.
Här är stenarna.
Men det är ju tecknen ifrån min dröm. Men...
Menar du att du har
Är det
sett
sant?
de här i en dröm?
Ja!
Och scenen vi har är besatt Åke åker båt. Så. Spänd av förväntan, men ingen förstår på vad riktigt.
Almost everything in this film is green screen. I think we have 2 or 3 shots in the entire movie that is real locations.
Börjar drömma och ler lite i sömnen. Och så vaknar du med ett ryck och sätter dig upp. Tack. Då kan du drömma otäckt.
Någon gång.
Jag psykade Kristoffer lite förra gången.
Men nu blir det så här, nu är du lite för lång där. Du får huka dig lite.
Ja.
Ja, varsågod.
The post-production is the most boring and the most time-consuming part of filmmaking, our kind of filmmaking. I think because you can keep doing it forever. There's no end to it, because there's always some levels to adjust, or something more to do to it. It's never finished, and there's a big project to collect all the images you need for the backgrounds.
seems to me that most of the amateur filmmakers tackling Lovecraft stories, they seem to adapt the same stories over and over again, and these tales do not necessarily need any complicated creature effects. This story does, and that's exactly why I wanted to make it. A professional film production will probably use computer-generated imagery to create the creatures in the Shadow Out of Time. But for an amateur filmmaker, it's far more cost-effective to use stop-motion animated puppets to create the effects. All of these puppets are made with very cheap and easy-to-use materials such as aluminum wire, bits of foam rubber, liquid latex, cotton and string. The great race of Yith was represented by just one puppet, then duplicated many times in After Effects. But I'm pretty sure you've already worked that out if you've seen the film. The round head, the cluster of red tubes, and the cone-shaped body were sculpted in Chavant clay and cast as latex skins in plaster molds. The head has 3 glass eyes, which I bought from a taxidermist supply shop. All the limbs, including tendrils and antennae, are pieces of aluminum wire wrapped in soft string and then covered with latex. The claws were sculpted in Chavant and cast in hard plastic from silicone molds. The flying polyps, the enemies of the Yith, were much easier to make. I bundled together bits of aluminum wire and covered it all with soft string and pieces of foam rubber. I cast latex skins from plaster molds and covered the 3 puppets with them. The flying polyps are very vaguely described by Lovecraft, but illustrators usually add gnashing mouths, bulging eyes, and other recognizable features. I just stuck with one of Lovecraft's remarks which, if memory serves me right, likens the polyps to cancerous growths. The polyp puppets were held aloft by aluminum wires painted blue. I finally spent the necessary money on some proper chroma key paint, blue and green, and I'm glad I did. Keying out both support rods and the background was incredibly easy. Besides the 2 opposing extraterrestrial forces, there are other creatures mentioned briefly in the story. Among them are the Arachnid denizens of Earth's last age, a kind of bugs that the Yith take possession of when they lose the war with the polyps and flee with their minds into the future. I wanted something that wasn't exactly a spider or a crab or a beetle. I hope I came up with something that was a mix of all these, and also that the creatures had a certain creepiness. The puppet had a cast latex shell, with all other parts of the body built up over aluminum wire using latex, cotton and string. I attached a jointed blue support rod to the creature's belly. This rod ended in a modified wingnut, which worked as a tie-down to fix the puppet to the animation stage. As with most of my animations, the Arachnid was animated in front of a blue screen, and the support rod disappeared in post-production. Another puppet built specifically for this project was the prehistoric Amphibian Eryops, which represented the early life forms the Yith encountered when they built their civilization on Earth. The Eryops was quickly built with foam padding over a plastic and aluminum wire armature, and lastly covered with latex skin. The head was sculpted separately and cast in latex from a plaster mold. The teeth of the Eryops were just saw-shaped paper cutouts, dipped in latex. 2 older dinosaur puppets were pressed back into service in a short clip that eventually ended up being shown on a monitor screen in a Yith laboratory. The skin on the meat-eating megalosaur was actually falling off as I animated it, so this was probably his last performance. I also did a scene with pterodactyls sitting on a rock and swooping down over the heads of some Yith botanists, but we eventually scrapped that shot. The Velusian serpent people very briefly mentioned were represented by another old dinosaur puppet. A sauropod whose tail and head were inserted into a still image of a guy in a monk's robe. This is terrible cheating, I know, but it got the job done without having to build an entirely new puppet for the few seconds the character is on the screen. Another example of cheapskate, dirty, amateur film tricks is the shot of a barbarian, a Cimmerian actually, standing atop a cliff with violent storm clouds rising behind him. The cliff is a still image and the man is a composition of 2 still images of local fantasy role players. The only things actually moving in this shot are the clouds, which is a stock footage clip, and the camera, which does a slow zoom-in created in After Effects. However, this shot is quickly followed by more stock footage of Viking reenactors beating the crap out of each other. Combined, the two shots hopefully sum up what Lovecraft refers to as the Dark Ages. More Photoshop magic includes all shots of the Yith moving about in their surroundings. The Yith city backgrounds are modified images of a Canadian art museum, and the interiors of the city are photos of various tileworks and synthetic carpet patterns. In many shots, the Yith are simply still images of the puppet, moving via 2D animation in After Effects. On some occasions, I've added animated tendrils to the underside of the head in these still images. And I know, more scandalous cheating. Some years ago I made my very own plastic idol of the Lovecraftian Cthulhu mythos deity Tsathoggua, created by Lovecraft's friend and fellow fantasist Clark Ashton Smith. I always wanted to include it in a film project, and I got my chance here, since the time-traveling hero at one point sees a vision of pre-human Hyperboreans worshipping the vile god Tsathoggua. I simply took a photo of the statue with a low light source and propped it up against a granite wall in Photoshop. The pre-human Hyperboreans were me, dressed in a cheap, long wig, dancing madly in front of a green screen, and then duplicated many times in After Effects. Strange, star-shaped sentinels guard the dungeons where the flying polyps are imprisoned, according to Lovecraft. These mysterious devices, dubbed starfish willies by Daniel, may be plants, maybe animals, or maybe some sort of biological machines. I designed them to be of ambiguous origin. I built only one, but 3 of them are visible in the film. Silicon molds were created over a 2-part Chavant sculpture, and plastic casts produced from the molds. The actual starfish willies were rigid, but I animated a sneaking tongue and inserted it into the middle of each star-shaped head. My idea was that the tongue was a hypersensitive sensory organ able to detect any unwanted movements from the polyps. Most of the historic and prehistoric scenes were created by layering Photoshop images and animated sequences. It's a really simple method, but it can yield pretty effective results. Lastly, I added softening filters and color grading to Daniel's shots of our hero, Åke. We decided to go with what we imagined was some sort of standard for how silent films were colorized, with a green tint for jungle scenes, blue for night and Arctic scenes, and so on. I think it worked out pretty well.
This is the corner where I created the music for The Shadow Out of Time. It took almost a week to make it. I wanted to have it dark and creepy in a way. I hope you feel that it is dark and creepy when you watch the movie. The theme song, The Shadow Out of Time, that you can hear in the opening titles, and when Nathaniel Peasley finds the box and is being hunted by this great black polyp out of the cave. That theme song I created back in 2011 when we started to shoot the whole movie in a small town called Lerdala, where Daniel grew up. So that's how it is. I hope you enjoyed the movie, and I drank a lot of coffee during this weird, mad process.
It's very fun to do Lovecraft movies like this one, and it feels like it's our way to give something back, not to Lovecraft himself because he's no longer around, but to the huge fan base around the world. So I think it's very fun.
I'd like to say that more than anything we wanted to show that even such a complex and epic story such as Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time can be managed as an amateur film project. And I often hear that, in fact people tell me all the time, that it's foolish for an amateur filmmaker to try and tackle grand stories and that it can't be done. Of course it can be done. You can retell any kind of story as a film. You can adapt Homer's The Iliad if you feel like it. You just have to figure out how to do it. There is a way to retell every story in film format, no matter how much money you have or how many or how few actors you have. The one thing you wouldn't want to do, however, is to try to emulate the multi-million-dollar blockbuster Hollywood movie-making machine, because they deal with resources that are beyond any kind of amateur filmmaking. And why would you want to emulate Hollywood, by the way? Because most of their films look alike. They are so formula-bound because the film companies making them, they want a quick return on their investment. And what you should do instead is look for inspiration elsewhere, like books, comic books, record covers, older movies that are far more diverse in their execution than modern day movies. And I'd just like to say that if more amateur or so-called independent filmmakers would just stop worrying about the precious projects, how they will turn out, and let the films evolve by themselves with what resources they have, not only would more films actually be finished, but they would be better films as well. So trust your instincts, trust your good taste, trust your abilities, and I think you will be surprised with what you can accomplish.